That's kind of a loaded question, and that's the wrong one. That's kind of a loaded question, I know. Because it would be like asking someone, who's the greatest all time Major League Baseball player? Who's the greatest all time NASCAR driver? It would depend. It would all come down to the individual. I have my own thoughts and ideals for every one of those questions I mentioned. I'm not going to give them to you. But if someone were to ask me, I tell them right off the bat. I began by asking, who was the greatest all time heavyweight boxing champion? I can tell you who thought or considered himself to be the greatest. February 25, 1964. Muhammad Ali, then Cassius Clay, defeated boxer Sonny Liston, who had been the heavyweight champion for a number of years. He was soon listed as the heavyweight champion of the world. I can still remember him and Howard Cosell. Seemed like they were always together. I can still remember him looking into the camera, some of you will as well, and saying, I am the greatest. Remember that? Perhaps won him a lot of fans, but I'm sure it won him a lot of enemies as well. Whether you agree with him or not, I think we would all have to admit that if he was not the greatest, he was certainly one of the top five. This evening, we're going to look at an incident that happened in the life of Jesus and his disciples. And we're following this theme. Who is the greatest? We are in Mark chapter 9. Mark chapter 9. What's really sad about this is you find this happening in the world, in the workforce, and sadly, you find it in church. People who are just totally convinced that they are the greatest pastor, evangelist, whatever. The disciples were having an issue with that as well. Mark chapter 9, verse 30. And they departed thence and passed through Galilee, and he being Christ, would not that any should know it. The masses of people have become so great that Jesus and the disciples are physically worn out. When it says he would not that any should know it, he's hoping that the word doesn't get out. But it does. Verse 31, for he taught his disciples and said unto them, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of men, and they shall kill him, and after that he is killed, he shall rise the third day. By the way, when we see this take place, after he's crucified, after the resurrection, he told them, did not I tell you earlier? This is a reference. He tells them in advance, beforehand, what's going to happen to him. They shall kill him, and after that he is killed, he shall rise the third day. But they understood not that saying, and were afraid to ask him. And he came to Capernaum, and being in the house, he asked them, what was it that ye disputed among yourselves by the way? But they held their peace. For by the way, here it is, they had disputed among themselves who should be the greatest. Now picture this. Jesus and his merry band are traveling. And he hears them talking among themselves. They are disputing. They're raising their voices. Who's going to be the greatest? They're still picturing Jesus in an earthly kingdom. Who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom? And he sat down and called the 12, and saith unto them, if any man desire to be first, hence the greatest, the same shall be last of all, and servant of all. And he took a child, and set him in the midst of them. And when he had taken him in his arms, he said unto them, whosoever shall receive one of such children in my name receives me. And whosoever shall receive me receives not me, but him that sent me, a reference to God the Father. And John answered him, saying, Master, we saw one casting out devils in thy name, and he followed not us. But we forbade him, because he followed not us. But Jesus said, forbid him not. For there is no man which shall do a miracle in my name that can lightly speak evil of me. For he that is not against us is on our part. For whosoever shall give you a cup of water to drink in my name, because ye belong to Christ, verily I say unto you, he shall not lose his reward. Three things we're going to focus on. We begin with a debate. A debate. Jesus and the disciples are traveling toward Capernaum. Christ overheard a disputing conversation between them. So when they get to the place they are going, he asks them, "What were you all debating about? What were you disputing about?" If we would use a word today, we'd probably say, "What were you all arguing about?" Because that's what they were doing. His question met with silence. No one gave an answer. I believe they were too embarrassed to answer him, because they had been discussing who was the greatest of them, the 12. What had prompted this? Oftentimes we talk about, in fact, I mentioned it this morning, the inner circle, right? Peter, James, and John. When Jesus was about to be transfigured, which took place on Mount Hermon, he took with him Peter, James, and John. Remember that? There on Mount Hermon, the transfiguration took place. So Jesus was there. God the Father was there because he spoke. Said, "This is my Son, in whom I'm well pleased." Those three disciples were there, Peter, James, and John, and two others showed up, remember? Two others of the great past. Moses, been dead centuries. Moses was there. Also there was Elijah. Moses and Elijah showed up at the transfiguration. What do you suppose is the significance of that? Most Bible scholars feel the reason Moses was there was because he was associated with the law, right? And Jesus respected the law. Not in regard to salvation, no. But he respected the law. He said, "I have not come to do away with the law." He said, "I have come to fulfill it." Big difference. So Jesus was paying respect to the law. By the way, we should also. We should respect the law. Those 10 commandments that so many people feel today are outdated, they are just as prominent today as when they were written. And I tell you, not in regard to someone being saved, but I tell you, it will go a long way with making individuals, families, countries, churches much greater if we could obey and live by those 10. They were given for the betterment of people. But what about Elijah? Well, Elijah is associated with miracles. Seems like every time you read about Elijah in the Old Testament, a miraculous thing takes place. That would be true also of Jesus Christ. Numerous miracles. We can read of literally dozens of miracles he performed, and that's the ones we know about. There could possibly be others that we don't even know about. But on that mountain, you have Jesus, God the Father at least speaking. You have the three, that inner circle, and Moses and Elijah. I believe it was Simon Peter who said, "This is a good place to be." Remember that? In fact, he went on to say, "Let's build us a temporary place and let's just stay here." He felt good on the mountain. When they come back down, Jesus told those three in the inner circle, He said, "Don't tell anyone what happened on the mountain. If they ask you, just tell them, we cannot share what happened because of the command of Christ." I personally feel that maybe this was the reason that they were disputing. I'm not saying Peter, James, and John did it. I'm not saying they bragged about it. We were on the mountain with Jesus. Where were you? I don't think they did that. They were not to talk about it. But I believe those other guys probably felt left out. Why didn't we get to go? Why did He pick them? Even in the story we read this morning, the miraculous healing of that little girl, He takes that inner circle in with Him then. That was just the way He did it. He obviously had a reason. If you don't know what that was, we'll ask Him when we get to heaven. I think the other guys probably felt left out. They began to converse among themselves. But they would not come out and answer Jesus and tell Him that was what it was about. A debate. Second, there's a demonstration. Jesus corrects the disciples by giving them an object lesson. This is good. He begins by speaking of a great paradox. A paradox is something that seems so right, so correct, and then on the other hand, it doesn't seem right altogether. A paradox. We could come up with all kinds of them. And Jesus speaks of one. He tells them the way to greatness is by serving others. In fact, the word servant in verse 35, it refers to those who wait on tables. A servant. And here's where the object lesson takes place. There is a small child among this gathering, and Jesus probably speaks to the parents and says, "Send the child to me." Now keep in mind, I've told you oft times, in Jesus' day, women were not esteemed. It was a man's world, to be honest with you. Now, the same thing could be said for children. Children were considered in many ways insignificant. And Jesus singles out this little child and says, "Bring him to me." Jesus is seated in the fashion of a teacher in that day, a rabbi. And he picks this little child up and he sets him on his lap. I think that's so tender. He speaks and shows us, no matter what the world thinks of how insignificant children are, he picks him up. And it says he embraces him. He puts his arms around him. He speaks of receiving a child in his name. And when they do, Jesus is saying, when you receive a child in my name, you are receiving the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. A demonstration. What an object lesson. A debate, a demonstration. Then there's a declaration. When you read this text, you almost find yourself wondering, how's that included in this story? It prompted John to mention an incident that had happened recently. Sometime earlier, the disciples had been out. Evidently, Jesus was absent. He was not with them. They had been out. And this particular incident, it's a little hard for us to comprehend because we don't have all the info. But it took place. There was someone who was practicing healing in the name of Jesus. The disciples tell Jesus, we were out recently and we encountered someone, and there were people who were sick, and this person was healing people in the name of Jesus. This was not someone who was a glorified faith healer. When they would touch these people, they would say something to the effect, in Jesus' name, be healed of your infirmity. And evidently, from the way the story reads, it was successful. There were people being healed. And the disciples, they panic. They don't understand this. And part of it we can understand, but there's another part that we don't. They didn't. Because he was not a part of them, they'd been casting out demons. And evidently, again, they were successful. But because they were not associated with the 12 goes to him and says, hey, you need to stop this. We are disciples of Jesus Christ. We don't know you. You are not a part of us. You've got to stop this. So it seems to me like John is trying to fill out Jesus, trying to get his ideal of what was going on. Jesus' response is great. He turns to his disciples and said, if they were doing this in my name and they were successful, you have no right whatsoever to forbid them. None. That's incredible. Now keep in mind, they were doing it in the name of Jesus. So who was going to get the glory? Jesus. They were not bringing glory to themselves. Jesus was getting the glory. I think it's easy for us to realize that when Jesus was on earth, those 12 men, and one of them you got to kind of throw out the window immediately because Judas was never saved. But those 11 were not the only followers he had. There were masses of other people who followed him. So what Jesus is saying here is this: if they were doing this in my name and they were successful, demon-possessed people were being healed, we are not to forbid them. In fact, I think Jesus goes as far as to say we should rejoice because God is using others to further His kingdom. Jesus said if they are not against Him, that they were working for Him. What a great principle. What a great message to all of us who are in places of leadership. We should never look at someone else who is being used of God. We should never look at another church where people are being saved, where baptisms are taking place, where the evidence of the Holy Spirit is. We should never look at another person or another place and look down upon them. What we should do is rejoice. Rejoice. Because it's all about the kingdom of God, the furtherance of His kingdom. Who is the greatest? Well, Mr. Ali will always be remembered for that statement. It's real easy for us to get wrapped up. It happened to the disciples. It can happen to us. The lesson we should learn is this, that paradox. If you want to be great in the sight of God and in the kingdom of God, become a what? A servant. Someone who waits on tables. That's greatness. Someone who gives a cup of water in Jesus' name. Jesus said that's greatness. That's greatness. What a great lesson to learn. Let's stand. I apologize.